Hello and welcome. This is Robin Harford from eatweeds.co.uk with another episode of the Eat Weeds podcast. I'm here today with John Rensten, author of... John, what's the title of your book?
It's called The Edible City, A Year of Wild Food.
Okay, so the reason that I've asked you to come on the show is I have a lot of people who live in urban environments, and the usual questions keep getting asked, which are, can we forage in a city? I mean, you've written the book on it. But more importantly, the safety aspect. So kind of where do you find clean plants? What about soil, etc., etc.? Do you want to kind of just go freeform with this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing to consider in the first place is that not all cities are the same. I mean, when I wrote The Edible City, I was living in London, and it's a monster, isn't it? It's 6 million people in Greater London and about 18 million, well, under normal circumstances, not the circumstances we're currently in the middle of the daytime, there'd be 18 million people in Greater London.
Wow.
Now, when I was looking at moving house, we looked at Bristol, and we were standing in Clifton, and you're in Bristol and you walk over a bridge and suddenly you're in the countryside. When you're in central London, you're certainly not going to be able to walk a few hundred yards and then leave the city. So a lot really depends on the city or the town or the urban conurbation that you're in. But I think there are a lot of really quite obvious, or maybe not so obvious, little rules that people can employ to keep them safe. And also, I think there's a few myths as well.
Okay.
Can I talk to you about that to start with?
Yeah, sure. The myths will be good.
I think the concept that the city ends and the countryside begins, and vice versa, is very much a social construct. And I think if you look on a good map, you'll see that the tendrils of the countryside reach into the city, and the tendrils of the city reach into the countryside. And along with that, there's this idea, I think, that, countryside clean, city dirty. And I found with 20 years of looking at this topic and quite a lot of research that's pretty much nonsense. There are a lot of areas of the countryside where I absolutely would not go foraging because of soil quality. And there's some amazing areas in very central parts of London and other big cities where I'd be completely happy to do so.
For someone who's just starting out, what are you looking for when you go round a gathering ground or a grazing ground? What conditions make you feel comfortable for gathering in that specific habitat or bioregion?
Well. Let's say we are in a big city. There's a lot of obvious places that you might head to. So a city like London is absolutely full of open and green spaces. It's something absurd, like 47% open and green spaces. When you think about London in your mind's eye, you think more of kind of blobs of grey than you do of green, really, don't you?
Yeah.
So the first thing that I would always suggest with anybody who was interested in the concept of foraging is the very best place that you can go foraging, and this is so relevant right now, is your most local green space. Rewind 3 or 4 months before we were in this strange situation, and if I told you, that there's wild plum trees fruiting prolifically in Victoria Park in East London, but you live in Richmond, there's no way you're crossing the city to go and pick some wild fruit. But if this is something that takes place at your local bus stop when you're on the way to work, then this becomes like a ritual, and it can become a way to form a lovely emotional relationship with landscape. So what I find is that generally I teach people to, I think you've touched on this topic as well, to start with a few plants, start with a knowledge base that you might already have, like what's a dandelion look like, what does mint look like, build on that, but also try and learn within your most local green space. And that doesn't have to be, oh, I wish I was close to Hampstead Heath, or I wish I was close to Richmond Common, or whatever it might be. In cities, there are lots of very peculiar, so we could call them new landscapes, linear landscapes, long, thin strips of land that might be neglected, weird little triangles, little bits of ground that don't classify as a park or a common. They may not even have a word to describe them, but often these are amazingly interesting and diverse little ecosystems. So first thing I'd say to people is go to your most local green space, which right now, I mean, with the lockdown situation, couldn't be more relevant. Secondly, I would suggest that with the gift of Google, you can do a little bit of research and you can look into the history of the land that you are intending to forage on. So
just to qualify that, when you say gift of Google, what kind of keywords would you be typing in to find?
Well, let's say I mentioned Victoria Park in East London.
Yeah.
So if I was considering foraging in an East London park, what I would probably do is I would Google that park and I would read a little bit about the history of it. And if I was reading about the history of Victoria Park, I'd find out it's been a park for a couple of hundred years. It predates the Industrial Revolution. The soil quality there has never been subjected to industry or agriculture. So as long as you stay away from the edge of the road, chances are the soil quality, which is a very good start, is going to be good. And in fact, I've had the soil quality in Victoria Park tested, and it's great. The flip side of that is, about 2 miles from there, there's a small park, the name of which escapes me, and they were in the process of kind of refurbishing it and planting it up with lots and lots of amazing edible plants. And it's the site of an old bomb factory. Now, I don't know what goes into making bombs, but I'm sure it's not good, and I'm sure you don't really want that in the soil of somewhere that you're foraging. So I would always try and do a little bit of research and see whether the place that I was planning to be picking from had a particular history of industry, especially in a big city.
That's really good news. So if you're looking on maps, so my way of exploring urban environments is I basically step outside and walk. When I hit a new urban place, I try not to use my maps or whatever. I actually just use my kind of inherent sense of direction and just inquisitiveness about what's around the corner, because I don't know whether you're like me, but I certainly know as being a human, I'm very habituated in my routines. And I can often, in the past, have lived in places where suddenly someone takes me down a side road that I've never been, and I've lived in the place for 3 years. One of the kind of the scouting gathering grounds, or what I refer to as finding your place, is to just start exploring out your front door. I met an author of a book a few years ago. He'd written kind of curious walks around Exeter, and he gave little games, and it was kind of like out your front door, turn left, then turn right, then take a third left. And it just opened you up to exploring your landscape, the urban landscape, in a way that most people never normally come across. And it's a brilliant way of finding those little quirky places. Like you say, those pockets of green that you normally wouldn't even think about. That if you ask someone, they talk about some park or whatever, a bit of wasteland somewhere. But it's, one of the things that, again, a myth, if we're myth busting, is that somehow you've got to, like you say, you've got to get out of the city and go straight into the countryside to forage, or you've got to cross town to forage, and that's just not true.
I think the closer you are to home, the more chance you've got to carry out an act of gentle repetition. You could visit a place, you could see not much going on, except from a novice forager's point of view, maybe quite a lot of low-growing, small, little green leafy plants, and not be so sure what they are. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, those same plants will be pretty much labelled if they've got flowers on them. Or at least there'll be a lot more information at your disposal. And I love the way of learning foraging in a very non-academic way. It's a gentle, linear process that takes place with lots of repetition of looking at the same things in different stages of development and building a sort of gentle knowledge base. You go, oh, that weird little thing has changed a bit. It's now got some spiky leaves, or it's now put out a little yellow flower, or whatever it might be. I definitely think staying, I mean, I sound like a government manifesto right now, stay local, you know. Stay local is for foraging is a brilliant way to learn. I lived in North London, and I lived close to, I don't now, I live in Dorset, but I lived for a long time, and I learned more about nature, about plants, about all sorts of topics from Clissold Park, which was like 1 square mile of North London, than I have learned from the rest of the country combined. And by the time I left, I picked and eaten 175 to 180 different species of edible plant from that park. Yeah. And it wasn't because I was after a clever number, and it also wasn't because that's a foraging hotspot or some, you know, these things are nonsense, really. Yeah. It was just because I'd been there a lot, and each time I went, it would give up something else. It would yield something different. Even when they put down a load of porter cabins to do a bit of refurbishing the park, when they took them away, that bare soil filled up with about 7 or 8 different sort of wild spinach species, which I'd never seen growing there, which must have just come in on the wind. So, definitely staying local. And I would say, if I was talking about like top tips, can I give you a couple of my top tips?
Sure. Far away.
So my first top tip for novice foragers and for experienced foragers is no nibbling. And what I mean by that is, if you can identify a delicious Oxeye Daisy, and you can try a bit of your delicious Oxeye Daisy, and you can graze along the hedgerows as you do, that's one thing. But if you are trying to identify plants, taking a bite of them is not part of the ID process. That's what you do with food. You stick it in your mouth. You don't stick things in your mouth when you don't know 100% what they are. And
totally.
I mean, how many emails have you had from people saying, I've been trying to work this out, and I've been trying to work that out, and it tastes a bit like that. And at that point, you're like, no, do not.
So, just to kind of push that point, I'm a big fan of nibbling, and I teach a lot about nibbling. But you only ever nibble, as in bring a plant anywhere near your mouth, once you're 100% certain. Outside, and so I have this saying: you've got to know it, not think you know it. If you catch your brain going, "Oh, I think it is," and then you pick it and are about to nibble it, you're in dangerous ground, because you do not want to do that with certain plants. And I've had people who say, "Oh, I'll just go nibbling everything," and it's like, well, you know what? You're 50 years old and you've survived so far, but next week might be the time you end up in the ground for being bloody stupid, and I, basically.
Robin, we have a mutual friend who was teaching a lovely group of women in Scotland the difference between, I think he had noble fir, which is edible, in one hand, and he had yew in the other hand, which is extremely toxic. And he was chatting, and he stuck the wrong one in his mouth.
Really? What happened?
He was fine, but he said the first thing he did was he rang his wife. So that basically, just don't use tasting things as part of the ID process unless you are a bit more advanced, or unless you are already most of the way into that process and you've already identified something. I would also say, and I think this applies in cities and it also applies in the countryside, all things in moderation. Don't be greedy. Don't be greedy with what is potentially a source of food for animals, what is a source of connection with the ecosystem, what is a source of food for other foragers, what might just look nice. But also don't be greedy, because I think it's sensible to not consistently forage the same plant from the same spot were there to be any issues with potential soil toxicity, etc., etc. I mean, in a true sort of hunter-gatherer style, move around. Don't treat nature like the supermarket and get everything from the same aisle. That's really boring anyway, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I totally go with that. I've been talking to some mates in America because they've got a real problem, and I know this is a debate, and there seems to be this kind of denial often in the foraging community that it doesn't happen. But they have a real problem with some of the wild medicines, not so much the wild foods. I might be corrected on that, but certainly some of the wild medicines are they're literally going extinct. You talk to United Plant Savers, and there's stuff in the States that has just disappeared because of over harvesting. So I've kind of been digging.
I know that's happened with the what's the really prized tricholoma mushroom, Matsuki.
Yeah.
But then I think it's weight for weight more expensive than gold or something like that. So yeah.
Sure.
When something becomes commodified, it then becomes desirable in the wrong kind of way. I mean,
yeah, it does.
I just always wanted to move around because I don't like the idea of going right. Aisle 7, hogweed. Aisle 3, nettles. Because even if aisle 7 is the spot next to the playground and aisle 3 is the bit over by the swings, whatever it might be, I still want to be more fluid in my activity.
Well, I think if you feed that back to humans as an animal, which a lot of people tend to forget, oh, you're behaving like an animal. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I am. Well, I am. Funny, I am an animal actually.
Yeah.
And that, and maybe as people like Michael Pollan have posited that we're grazers. So a grazing animal doesn't just hang out in one clump. It moves around all the time, taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there. I like that as a foraging practice for myself, especially when beginners are starting. It's like, look for a plant community that has a lot of bounty within it. So if you just find one little clump of dandelion, just leave it alone. You really don't. Sure. It's so prolific elsewhere, and just keep walking and finding out and mapping. I always try and encourage people to see foraging as a journey of discovery and an adventure. It's like seeking gold. You're just
absolutely
digging around and take a little bit. 1 or 2 leaves from one plant community, move on, because it's about diversity. It's not about monoculture. We're just going to get dandelion. I know recipes, and I do it, can focus on one plant as a primary ingredient. But the point is that you're gathering a large swathe of different plants.
Yeah, and I think if you're looking for diversity and you're looking for sort of increased fertility. When you look at the way they teach, for example, say permaculture as opposed to the standard ideas of monoculture, you're trying to create as many borders, as many edges, as much periphery as you possibly can. And as you know so well, those are the places where things are really thriving. You go walking deep into a woodland, you don't find that much. You're on the edge of the woods. That's where all the mushrooms are going crazy. They're sporulating and fruiting and trying to cross the road that's been put in there to colonize the next area. There's all sorts of activity going on the edge. So yeah, you keep walking and you keep moving. And I do a little bit of it's always unsuccessful foraging to order, and I mean for myself, not for other people. So every April I head out looking for morels, and 20 years, every April, I am unsuccessful. But every year, I always come back with a great big basket of all sorts of other things that I've found in the process.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think if we're looking at foraging in urban environments, it goes without saying, these are unusual times. And you know that when we spoke a few days ago, my main concern was, here I am, I'm like Mr. Urban Foraging. I've been encouraging people in urban environments to engage with their local landscape for like 2 decades. And now I've suddenly got reservations about creating a situation where people are lingering on their permitted exercise for the day. And I think when I'm normally teaching people foraging, I'm talking to them about spending quite a bit of time with plants and getting to know those plants. And under the circumstances we're in at the moment, from my point of view, talking to people about how they act in very, very populated cities, I think people need to stick, if they're novice foragers, they need to stick with, and if they're not, to be honest, they need to stick with what they know, and that means things that they can collect quickly, and not basically spending a load of time hanging out, trying to work things out. And that, in a way, restricts quite a lot of the plants that I would suggest for people. Having said that, there's an awful lot of plants that I wouldn't suggest that I teach people about via a podcast. It's a very personal, hands-on experience, isn't it? If you're teaching people about members of the carrot family, where you've got a lot of the delicious and the deadly often holding hands, you need to be right down and dirty with people and be involved and in a first-hand experience. But at the moment, I think we could equip people with, I hate the word fail-safe, but with a list of easy-to-forage plants, providing they think about the other safety aspects. I don't want to make foraging into a scary topic. It really is not. With a little bit of common sense, it's a brilliant thing to do. It's a lovely way to engage with the landscape, to help with your health and your nutrition, and get some free food, and do something with your kids, and get off screens, and a million other climbs onto soapbox pro foraging reasons. But I do think people need to be mindful of, well, I think everybody is mindful of our current situation, but I think it's important that people's behaviour is, if they're going to go foraging, is adapted to take that into mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I for me personally, I know I've come under a lot of attack on social media in certain quarters of the kind of the histrionics and the rather dramatic claims of, oh, the NHS is under enough pressure, we don't want, you're just encouraging people to basically screw up and end up in A&E, putting even more stress on the limited resources that are available. And my answer to that is, you don't eat anything you don't know 100%. Like you say, in this particular time, you need to be able to identify it quickly. So everyone knows stinging nettle. Pretty much everyone knows dandelion. Just keep it at that level at this time. So have you got a kind of list of plants? I mean, for me, you can, when you hear this list, you can get your wildflower books out and start doing the kind of, has it got this and that? But what I think you're saying, John, is that you're trying to encourage people not to spend like an hour IDing a plant, which, because of the curiosity factor, could attract other people. Because let's face it, humans are a bit like magnets. You know, you sit in you start staring at a plant and fiddling around it in a slightly odd way, other than the usual stand back and observe, and people are going to get curious and try and come in and engage with you, and that's where potential problems could happen.
And you know, as well, I'm not necessarily the best one in the world for following rules, but right now I'm doing what I've been told, and I'm as much as possible staying in. And even though part of me is going, well, if I went to the beach, it's about 5 miles away. That's also my exercise, and also I'm sourcing food. But actually, it's kind of not. It's taking the piss. So I don't really want to encourage anybody to do that. There's a few other things to be thoughtful of, and obviously there are poisonous plants and there's poisonous mushrooms, but as I've been telling people on my mushroom walks for over a decade, if the ultimate destination of the mushrooms that you pick is on your compost heap, not on your frying pan, they can never harm you. They're not going to jump out at you from behind a bush. You know, I think people are fungi phobic, aren't they?
They are, very.
I think it's worth staying away from busy roads, if you, as much as possible, researching the soil quality, being mindful of things like dog poo and dog wee. I love flower beds that have been turned over by the Parks Authority and then put stakes all around them, and then nobody or anything can get in there except wild plant seeds, which just come in and populate, and it's lovely. I think it's really important to wash everything. Not mushrooms necessarily, and not, but if you're in an urban environment, I mean, it's not in a plant's interest to accumulate heavy metals. It's not part of its modus operandi, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. But
sure,
if there is toxicity in the soil, there's going to be a lot more of it present in the soil than there actually is in the plant matter. So one thing you should just do is make sure you wash off anything like that.
From your research, where do you find most of those kind of heavy metals accumulating? Which parts of the plant that maybe people, if they are slightly kind of sensitive, I suppose?
In the root. I mean,
sure.
low growing herbaceous plants, generally speaking, I would gather things away from busy roads. I mean, my experience of this is like when I soil tested Clissold Park, I sent it off to a company who kind of did it as proper due diligence before I published my book, and I knew what the answer was already, but I wanted a bit of science behind it. And we tested under the parameters of soil quality for home vegetable growing.
Okay.
So that they test in parts per million, and what they were testing for was cyanide, glyphosate, things like that. I can't remember specifically at the time, but everything came in comfortably within the tolerance that they would consider acceptable for home vegetable growing.
Right.
And that was on the edge of Clissold Park and on the edge of Victoria Park. And then in the centre of the park, the soil quality came in even better.
Yeah.
Which was really, really encouraging to me.
Absolutely. Other than soil quality, the other questions that people ask me continually are, what about foxes, badgers, other animals? What about dog mess, dog urine, human urine? I get that you're saying to wash the plants, but what are the kind of, there's Weil's disease that people can get.
For sure.
But I often defer to people who have allotments, when people say that. It's like, well, do you ask those questions when your friend hands you a bag of vegetables from their allotment in London or whichever city or town they're in? So what's your take on that kind of stuff? Because I know you wrote a bit you touched on it in your book.
20 years of eating an awful lot of things from an urban environment, and I haven't had any problems personally or heard of anybody that has in like a first hand. I've never had an email from somebody saying I ate that and it made me sick. What I try to do is, like I say, I research, if I can, the history of the area, and then I also look at the lie of the land. And if you're looking at the edge of a pathway and it looks like you're walking straight into a park and it's just the edge little bit of a park, this is obviously where everybody lets their dog wee and poo. This is so use a bit of common sense.
Yeah.
And then when I come to look at the plants themselves, it's very much like you choose produce in a supermarket or in a food shop. If I'm looking for stinging nettles, I'm looking for a lovely, fresh, vibrant, almost more yellow than green, that lovely happy colour. I'm not looking for something that looks a bit scorched or something that looks sort of desaturated and a bit dowdy. I'm always looking for things that look extremely good. in terms of wee, I mean, our wee and dog wee are quite acidic. If you wee on some plants, if they're being repeatedly weed on, they're going to be scorched. They're not going to look good. Sometimes the most amazing place for things to grow is the least appropriate place to forage it. Like if you look under an awful lot of urban trees, you'll find the most wonderful crop of chickweed.
Yeah.
With all the assistance of all that lovely nitrogen from dog's wee, it's not really the place to forage it, but it's a place where it grows prolifically.
Dog pee areas are good to ID plants.
Well, there's that lovely French botanist who goes around. I've slightly stolen his idea. He goes around his local town, and he just labels all the plants on the pavement with chalk, and they're growing out the side of the bus stop and everywhere. I think it's also important to bear in mind, like most big parks have got a no dog area, but foxes and badgers and rats and all those others, they can't read that sign.
Sure.
So a bit of common sense, really. And what's the lovely lady up in the north of England called Mina? She said, "Never munch on a hunch." And it's not absolutely 100% about your identification, about the environment that it's in. If there's anything that is causing you concern, just don't do it.
Yeah. What kind of plants have you got? I know you mentioned you got a small list of the kind of the go-to, easy to gather without breaking all the kind of containment rules that we're all subjected to at the moment. So what have you got that you...
Well, what I've done, I wrote a really quick list.
Yeah, so we're in April. We're at the beginning. We're on April the 10th during this recording.
Yeah. Stinging nettles. I mean, the idea of these things is looking at plants that have multiple crops, that if you become familiar with them, you'll be able to return to them later in the year when they give you something else. And very often, we say something like dandelion, you've got 3 different edible crops. With say wild garlic or something, you've got 5 different edible crops, and you can enjoy these at different stages by learning to identify one plant. So with the stinging nettles right now, that's a brilliant plant to forage for. You can collect them with gloves and scissors, or you can get stung a little bit, or you can collect them with gloves and just tug at the plant, and the point at which the top part of the plant, maybe the top 4 to 6 inches, naturally yields and goes. That's the point at which you've got all the lovely soft fibres coming away and the more woody ones down below. And numerous culinary uses for nettles. I've done a video about it, but I think pretty much every forager I know has done a video about how to pick and cook nettles at the moment. So there's no shortage of that online. Dandelions are a really useful plant to forage for. You've got a green leaf, a salad leaf, albeit quite a bitter one, unless you can find them growing in long grass where they will have been forced in the same way as you force rhubarb. So they will have been starved of sunlight and they've had to pull their nutrients up through their root system. So they've grown without so much photosynthesis. So they're paler and a lot less bitter. And you've got flowers, which you can make sauces and syrups and vinegars and wines and all sorts of things from. And you've got an edible root on dandelion as well. You can dig the root up, and you can do all sorts of things with a dandelion root. You can roast it like a vegetable, and it will release lots of its sugars, and it's a tasty thing to eat. Or you could marinate it in some soy or something like that.
Can we just touch on the fact that if we are digging up roots, that you do need landowners' permission?
Absolutely. So that really comes down to sort of common sense and the law, and you do need the landowner's permission to uproot anything. I used to run a lot of walks for groups of students, and I used to say to them, well, you all live in a communal house with a completely neglected back garden, don't you? And they go, well, how do you know? And I go, well, because you're students, everybody does. Get out there and you'll have loads of dandelion and loads of burdock, and you can dig it up. Right now, cherry blossoms are coming through. For me, I think the primary crop in sort of wild or semi-wild terms is the blossoms, not the cherries themselves. I'd like to leave the cherries for the birds. Wild cherry flavour varies enormously. And for my sins, what I really like is those ones that are big, fat, juicy cherries that are farmed in Kent. you know. But cherry blossom, commercially, they make a cherry blossom syrup in Japan, which is amazing. And those blossoms, they're what gardeners call showy. They're big fat bunches of blossoms.
Yeah.
And you can cook them up with a little water and make this delicious almondy essence kind of syrup from them. Or you can just eat the blossoms. The blossoms are a kind of a lottery, really, as with a lot of wild foods. It's the blossoms will taste of three things. They'll either taste sweet or bitter, or of almond oil essence, or of any one, two, or three of those in any kind of combination.
Right.
So that, that, what's the expression? Suck it and see. That really does apply to that. And I think if you're in any doubt about identifying a cherry tree, there's enough information online, and you're looking for a tree that has got lots and lots of horizontal stripes all over it. They're called lens cells. They're part of its respiratory system. But they're very
stripes on what? On the blossoms or on the bark?
Stripes, sorry, stripes on the bark, on the tree itself. You've got lots of horizontal stripes. I've also got mint on my list, and the reason I put mint on here is mint isn't really, unless you're buying mint from the shop, mint isn't exactly a wild plant. It's in the UK, it's 50 or 60 different wild plants. Yeah. But I think everybody can identify mint by its smell, and we've got a lot of different varieties of wild mint in the UK. So long as you pick a plant which looks like mint and smells like mint, square stem. So if you get the stem in your hands and you roll it between your fingers, it's got four distinct sides to the stem, and its leaves come in opposite and opposing pairs. That means one pair sticks out one way and the next pair sticks out the other way, next pair sticks out the other way, and so on and so forth. And it looks like mint and it smells like mint. It's going to be mint.
And it's hairy. Yeah, for sure. And I don't know about you. I did a blog called very flippantly titled "How to Identify 50 Plants in 10 Minutes." But it's about how to learn all the members of the mint family by their key characteristics. There's that lovely chap in the States, Thomas Elpel, who wrote a book called Botany in a Day, and it's all about the patterns method of recognition, and this is basically the patterns of the mint family: square stems, opposite and opposing leaves, strong smells, and there's lots of other things in the mint family that don't smell like mint, but generally speaking, it's a good family for foragers. Yeah.
Looking at.
And just to quickly interject again, you mentioned Thomas Elpel's book Botany in a Day, and I have a lovely friend, Mark Williams, who actually helped Thomas put together the latest edition. And Mark has a website called botanyeveryday.com, and he currently has an online botany class that takes you through that book. It's on donation, so if you're interested, just go and hit Mark's website, botanyeveryday.com.
I've seen that. That looks really good.
Yeah, Mark is a phenomenal ethnobiologist.
So this is American Mark Williams, not lovely Scottish foraging teacher Mark Williams.
Yeah, not the Scottish one, the American one.
There's quite a few of them around, actually, Mark Williams's.
Are there? Two common names.
So also on my list of easy to identify, and this isn't going to be out yet, but this is going to be coming through, which is Oxeye Daisy. So if anybody can identify because I'm going with plants that basically kids in the UK can identify. If anybody can identify a daisy, which is a little baby lawn daisy, and it's got a yellow composite middle, and it's got an array of white petals around the outside. If you imagine that had been down the gym for about 3 months and ended up enormous. So if you come across what basically looks like a daisy with a daisy flower that's maybe the size of a ping pong ball on it and is about 2 foot high, that is an Oxeye daisy. And that's got edible leaves and it's got edible flowers. The only thing you need to be wary of is your own haste, because if it's got a yellow middle and it's got yellow petals, it's not an Oxeye daisy, it's ragwort, which is potentially poisonous. But
Yeah.
basically, if you come across a white and yellow, looks like a daisy, but it's really tall, like I say, about 2 foot tall with a bloody great flower on it, that's Oxeye Daisy. And that's a really tasty flower, really tasty leaves. And then with that, you can do what I often teach people, which is learning your plants in reverse. So you learn them when it's got all of its ID information on show. In this case, the fail-safe is this bloody great big daisy flower on the top.
Yeah.
And you work backwards. You look at the leaves, and you can see the shape of those leaves, and you can become familiar with those leaves. So the following season, you'll be able to identify this plant, possibly because you're back in exactly the same location, if you're staying local, and also because you've become familiar with what they look like, and you'll know what they look like before the flower comes out to complete the picture for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So at the moment, online, and just about everywhere, people are going wild garlic crazy, certainly in the foraging community. It's an amazingly prolific plant. It's very common when you find it. I mean, the woods up the road from me, there's a square mile of the stuff, quite literally. One of the great things about wild garlic is it absolutely stinks of garlic. There are no half measures with it. And if you make sure that what you're picking reeks of garlic, and you follow a few other little safety rules, you've got a wonderful plant which has got edible flowers, edible seeds, edible stems, edible leaves, and edible bulbs. So it's got 5 potential food crops. I would say the hazards inherent in picking wild garlic are the other plants that it grows with that are not wild garlic.
Yeah.
And the problem, I suppose, is that when people find an abundant source of free, delicious food, they get a bit excited and they grab too much of it. And that's the point at which you're going to pick things like lords and ladies, or bluebells, or dog's mercury, or probably a couple of other plants that grow intermingled with wild garlic. So what I would suggest for something like this is, first of all, you've got to absolutely be sure with the smell. If you decide to pick something and you poison yourself, and your get out of jail free card is, well, it smelt a bit garlicky, that is not enough. It absolutely stinks of garlic. I'm considering whether it should be on the list now, to be honest, because of the things that grow with it.
Yeah, there's quite a lot. I have to say that I was in Wales one year. No, not Wales. I was in Cumbria, and we were coming down with my friends out of the woods, and I saw this guy with a carrier bag coming up the road, and he leapt into the wood, and within about 5 minutes had leapt back out with a full carrier bag of supposedly wild garlic. And I had a leaf of lords and ladies in my hand, and as I came up to him, I went, "What you got there?" And he went, "I've got what you've got in your hand." And I went, "Really?" I said, "What's that then?" And he said, "Oh, wild garlic." I said, "No, this isn't wild garlic. This is lords and ladies, and it's poisonous." And he went ashen. And he said, "Blimey, I'm a chef. I'm about to serve the wild garlic for like the covers for lunch." And I said, "Well, you need to go through it." So I took him through the ID, because it once you clock it, it's actually very easy to see the difference.
Yeah, for sure.
But it is that thing of when you gather, don't be greedy. You know, we're so used and indoctrinated by supermarkets that we don't have to think, is a carrot a carrot? But in the wild, they're not monoculture. Monoculture is where everything else other than that primary plant is growing, has been basically annihilated. But in the wilds, like you said earlier, you had that wonderful, what was that saying you said? You said delicious and deadly holding hands. And
yeah, for sure.
That's a really good saying. And people do need to be aware about it. Be gentle with plants. It's not a race. It's not a fight. It's about respect. And also the problem with grabbing a bunch of plants and snipping them or cutting them is you're going to get a load of rubbish quality leaf matter and plant matter in there that you wouldn't want to eat. So be dutiful. I think that's the word. and diligent and respect the plant communities. They allow us to breathe. So we don't just go in and just trash them. We go in and we carefully gather. And some of my mates in the States, they're very conscientious about this. So they say that when you have gathered, you shouldn't be able to look at that plant community and see that a human has gathered from it. And I think that's a really good thing to bear in mind. Now, that doesn't necessarily, or isn't going to necessarily happen all the time, but certainly as a gathering protocol, I think it's important. The other one is to, maybe not so much in an urban environment, but, make yourself a bit invisible. Don't be showy about it. Be like a deer in the woods. They're very big. You can see them very easily, but because of the way they carry themselves through the wood, they're actually very hard to see as well.
No, I really agree with that. And the way that I've done a ton of my foraging in urban environments is, it's not because what I'm doing is illegal. It's just basically because I don't want to have to explain myself to everybody all the time. So when I would run a walk and I'd meet a group of people, I'd walk up swinging a basket so they can recognise me. They either go, that guy's very comfortable about his sexuality, or he must be the forager,
Or both.
But when I'm out doing my own foraging, I am not flouncing through the park swinging a wicker basket. I've got a nice little cloth bag, and I am crouched down in amongst the nettles. I'm not hiding, but you're being kind of respectful and being a bit subtle about it. Can I come back to the wild garlic for a sec?
Sure.
I think what you're saying is brilliant, and I want to say, right on, brother, when you're talking about being respectful of everything. If you can learn to identify a wild garlic leaf, and this is a leaf that's called a lanceolate leaf. That means it's spear-shaped, so it's pointy at the top, and it comes into a tapering point as it joins the stem at the bottom, and it absolutely stinks of garlic. If you can learn to identify that leaf, and when you take that leaf, you trace it down to the bottom, and you snip off that and its adjoining leaves, and you put those in your bag or your basket, whatever, you're not going to be mixing up other plants. All the other plants I've mentioned, if you held one up, if you held a wild garlic leaf up, and you held up a bluebell, you held up Lords and Ladies, you held up Dog's Mercury, whatever it was, it's going to be really obvious. It's only going to be not obvious if you're hasty, greedy, and not behaving with the mindset that you've just discussed. I just don't want anybody to end up putting themselves in danger, really.
Sure. First and foremost,
so
safety
I think
first.
Kind of over-egg the pudding a little bit. The other things on my list, and they're not necessarily, well, right now, primrose and primula. So a lot of people can recognise primula as the garden plant, which is a domestic version of wild primrose. Every year when I post some pictures of primrose, somebody comes up with, that's protected. It's not protected. It's not a protected plant. Wild cowslips are protected. Primrose is very common. You're not going to sustain yourself particularly from this. What you can do is you can gather primrose flowers, which are a beautiful little yellow flower, grows on a low growing, it has these beautiful they're called obvate leaves, which is like a kind of upside down oval, and very sort of light pale green. I think a lot of, if you look online, you can find a nice picture of primrose or primula, and the wild version have these lovely little pale yellow flowers that are very sweet. They're floral. They're really nice I don't know if they have any medicinal value going there at all, but they make a really kind of calmative tea just because they've got such a nice, gentle, soft, everything's going to be all right kind of flavour to them. And they're sweet. And our friend Fraser likes to make wine with primrose flowers. And you can use the leaves sparingly in a salad. I think a bit of a strong flavour. So I'm introducing people to plants, often plants that they know and sometimes ones that they don't, that they can engage with on multiple occasions throughout the yeir, and will give them different food sources. And I think that's a wonderful way to learn foraging and a wonderful way to engage with the plants and to engage with nature, etc., etc. You know, right now there's quite a few plants, because of the way in which you'd learn them and because of safety concerns, that I'm not going to bring into this list. But if I was writing my top 10 survival plants that you really want to know, it's going to be a different list to this one. I think if you're picking primrose flowers right now and you're picking them sparingly, you don't want to go crazy, it's a nice thing to do. It's a pleasant activity for somebody who's stuck on the 16th floor of their flat in Bethnal Green and goes for a walk in the park with their kids, and they're able to pick some little flowers, engage with the process, bring them back, look in a little book, maybe identify them, maybe draw them, maybe do stuff like that. Apart from the aspect of collecting food, I think being able to do something like that right now emotionally ticks a lot of other boxes.
The whole aspect of when a plant is in flower, like John said earlier, you know, what did you say? Learn plants in reverse. You know, primrose is classic. Take one flower, one stem, one leaf, and go home with your kids. Get them to draw it. Get them to pay attention. Fine tune your observation skills, because a lot of people don't see plants. In botany, it's called plant blindness, and one of the ways to get through plant blindness is to take a plant, put it in a vase, and draw it. And I do have to stipulate, these drawings are not for public consumption. You know, I'm appalling at drawing flowers. That's why you never see any of my drawings online. But that's not the point. I'm not doing it for someone else. I'm doing it for me to develop a deeper relationship from a kind of observation point of view. And drawing is really, really important. So, you know, you're bang on the money there, John.
Yeah, my drawings are awful too. My drawings are terrible, but it's a really rewarding process. And I really like my own drawings. It's a bit like your own singing in the bath. It's crap, but it serves a purpose. The rest of my list are kind of with, you know, other things are coming in and things are going out. We could include crow garlic on this list, which is basically wild chives, and a lot of people can identify chives. It's got these beautiful single round pointy long stems. It looks like domestic chives. If you're looking at a grassy bank or something, it's a totally different type of green. It's a green that's got a lot more blue in it, a kind of cyan colour, and you can see it against the background. I mean, I love, you know, when people think about it, they go, yeah, it's greens. There's so many things that are described as greens, but very often the dominant colour in those greens will be something else, and that will be how, when you're really familiar with it, that you spot it at 200 yards, like seeing an old friend in a crowd of people. It's more like facial recognition, ultimately, than anything to do with botany.
Very much, I think, and again, that goes back to the plant blindness, that the more we go out and engage with plant communities, the more our eyes fine tune. And brilliant example of what you said, you know, it's like seeing a long lost friend in a crowd of people. You know, they're all humans, but they stand out because you know them well.
I mean, I think I could tie on to this things like rose, because there's numerous varieties of domestic and wild rose, and they've got edible petals, and they're going to produce edible rose hips, and they've got, when the leaves are young, they've got edible leaves that you can use for tea. And you could look at blackberry in exactly the same way as that. You know, they've got edible fruits, and they've got edible leaves at the right time of year. The only reason I include those is because, from a point of view of people in the UK being able to identify them, it's very easy. And then, you know, the year will roll on. I hope, to be honest, that quite a lot of the things that would spring to mind as we come around to autumn, that this is a conversation about foraging, not a conversation about foraging in lockdown, really. I would also say that the way I've always taught foraging and the way I taught myself foraging was multifaceted, but one thing that was really useful was learning a couple of plant families. And like I say, learning the mint family is really handy. And it's fun thing to do with kids as well. You know, you can just look at the stems, you could do a little dance about how the leaves go that way, then the leaves go that way, and then leaves are your kitchen raving if you're doing the opposite and opposing leaves dance. And there's the cabbage family is also a really good plant family to look at. We've got about 100 wild members of the cabbage family in the UK, and none of them are poisonous, even though a few of them will taste pretty horrible. And some of them, if you tried to eat your own body weight in, you're going to give yourself an upset stomach. But, you know,
Sure.
that's going to apply to a lot of things. I'm sure you've got tons of information about this. And I've written on Forage London, I've written a blog about how to identify members of the cabbage family. And I've also written a blog about how to identify members of the mint family. And within those, you're then moving into areas of safety, because you know that if you are in the right plant family, you're not going to encounter plants that are poisonous. There's nothing on my list here from the carrot family. Far too many risks. So if people are considering something like wild garlic or anything that's over in that kind of allium, lily, iris sort of department, that they've got to be so careful about this issue of smell, which is why, you know, I come back to it. Wild garlic utterly bloody reeks of garlic. If it doesn't, it's not it.
The rule is, if you are not 100%, an absolute 100%, and an old mentor of mine, Marcus Harrison, once described it as it's like going into a newsagent. You're looking for milk. Your hand reaches out, gets the milk. Your brain doesn't even engage. Oh, is that milk? Isn't it milk? It is milk. And that's what you need to have when you meet a plant. Don't put it in unless your hand reaches out. Oh, primrose, boom. Job done.
Yeah, for sure, which is why, especially in the current situation, I don't want to encourage anybody to do anything that's stupid or to do anything that's hasty. And I think if we're sticking to things that people know, you know, like I say, nettles, dandelion, cherry, mint, things like that.
Yeah.
I think people are on sensible or safe ground if they're being sensible. And then, as I'm sure you know, you must have written about this a lot in a way. Plant ID is just the entry level. That's
Sure.
the beginning of the whole process. It's then finding out what you can do with this wonderful thing you've got. It's finding out what the history of it is, what numerous different people have done. I mean, we've spoken about this. You know, you'll be foraging for a plant for 15 years, and then one day you'll think, I wonder what that bit of it's like, or I wonder if I do that, and suddenly you've discovered something new about it that you hadn't come across. Or when you're teaching and you get a group of people say, can you eat the root on that? And you go, oh, I actually never considered it. I don't know. Shall we, you know, it's a constantly evolving process, isn't it?
Totally. And we're all learning from each other. And that's one of the joys of the foraging community, is that people just share their discoveries. So whatever you do with it, it's, you know, I always wanted to set this wild food challenge as something like dandelion and just get people to get dandelion, create something with it and post it on Instagram or some other social media with a hashtag and just see how far it can go. It's just impressing that, you know, one of the things like wild garlic, you know, everyone does pesto. Well, that's great. That's really good. If you're just starting out, making pesto is a fantastic thing to do with wild garlic. But what else can you do with it? What other bits of it, like the flowers or the buds, can you do with wild garlic? What I do encourage is for people to get in touch with their own inner creativity. That comes from people feeding back to me on courses, you know, the frustration with cooking programs like MasterChef, etc. You know, you do not, again, you're doing it for you. You don't have to instantly post it on Instagram. It's about exploring and playing in the kitchen, playing with your senses as you're creating dishes and starting to trust that you do actually know how to cook, just might not look particularly Michelin star quality work of art. So what? It's about you developing a deep relationship with the cooking plant in your kitchen and seeing what you can come up with. And that can be as simple as you want. I do really simple food. Or it can be as complex and artistic as you want to go, depending on what your kind of nature is, I suppose.
For me right now, I was thinking the other day about when I wrote the Edible City. One of the things I put in the introduction was about finding nothing more rewarding than cooking for my friends and family and my loved ones with food that I'd foraged myself. And I wrote it and I meant it, but I'd never really, really fundamentally experienced that until I thought I had, but I hadn't. About 2 weeks ago, and we're in lockdown and we're walking along, and I was picking plants with my son and talking about what we're going to do and what we're going to cook and how that's going to be nice. And I really did experience that sense of fundamentally providing, I suppose. And that was this nice experience, and a nice to have a genuine and almost kind of brand new emotion after 20 years of foraging from something that I've been doing for such a long time. And I thought I'd felt that, but I realised I'd never quite totally got it, even though I'd written it in the introduction to my book.
Yeah. It's one of my most pleasurable aspects of cooking is making. So I do lots of kind of tapas. Those who've listened to my stuff before know that I do lots of tapas styles, and I love spending most of a day gathering the plants, coming back, making that dish, setting up beautiful kind of. We sit on the floor in my house when we eat, when we have friends over, putting out nice throws on the ground and making it a beautiful experience for people. The word kinship comes to mind. I was in an airport in Dubai one year, and a Muslim family came over, and we were there for 14 hours, and they shared their food and they put their cloth down and sat down, and that was the inspiration for me. It was like, there's a real depth in this relationship, even though we're actually strangers. And, in Islam, there's this concept, I think it's zatak, which is you give to people who are less fortunate than you. And at that point, we didn't have any food. They did, and they invited us to eat. And obviously, it was the men that we ate with. My partner, she ate with the women, and I ate with the men. But there was a quality and a richness to that meeting of strangers. And it was that sitting on the ground and sharing food. And there's something very beautiful and wholesome about gathering food with or without your friends, and then making it for your friends and sharing the bounty that you've discovered.
Yeah, for sure, isn't it? It's the way we've existed for the majority of our time on this planet, and the way that most people and the way that we exist now is become the norm, but it isn't the norm.
Thank you, John, for coming on the show. Been trying to get you on for a long time. We finally got there. Is there anywhere, where can people get hold of you if they want to follow up on your work?
They can look on my website, which is foragelondon.co.uk. They can find me on Instagram or Facebook. That's about it, really. They can find my book online, the Edible City.
Yeah, I'm going to be I'll be putting links to your social media kind of hangouts and your website in the show notes.
It'd be really nice to have a chat.
Yeah, thanks.